Now, this is where things start to go because I hadn't filled in things. See this graph on top? That is gross world product from 1961 to 1997 or something. And it's the frequency, the number of times the growth rate was, say, between 3% and 3.49%. The number of times, well, here it was 7 times between, at this level. You get the gist. Now, it's an interesting point. For most of human history, there wasn't growth, or it was local. It happened in different places at different times. Between about 1500 and 1870, it was about 0.06%, so much lower than we'd know. And then from about 1880, it started to rise at what is a remarkably constant rate. Okay? I mean, now it's normal growth is 3 or 4%. Why? Why not 27%? Then drop by 36, then up by something else. Why not oscillate randomly like this? Why not have any other dynamic? What you see is remarkable stability. And if you plot, there's another graph that have that's kind of all OECD and everything thrown in, and it's a remarkable curve. You see a few outliners, big depressions, but really remarkable stability. And part of the reason we know that we're in a zone of stability is because if you start going outside this, just by a few percent, you start to cause major stresses in the system. You either have social stresses, you have financial stresses, etc. So something remarkably stable, we could say. Even despite the change, it's been remarkably stable. And of course, it's been at a rate we could adapt to, because here we are, adapted to it. In fact, we've built worlds out of it. People are investing their pensions 40, 50 years hence on the basis of it. People are buying mortgages. People are doing all sorts of things, how they educate their children. All sorts of things are based on that we have had this remarkable stability. And of course, this has taken energy. And of course, in a very direct way, if you're looking at systems, you kind of go, well, any system in ecology, in engines or whatever, energy is always the key. And here you have complexity more generally. This value here, see here, this is energy per second per gram. Okay, so we're talking about energy flow per unit mass, okay, going through. And what we see is that if we try and look at rising complexity, we see that it rises, stars or planets are more complex than stars, animals or plants more complex than planets, etc., all the way up to society. And what we see is, firstly, that you have this growing and growing flow-through of more and more energy per unit mass. So our civilization is much, much smaller than, say, the weight of our civilization than, say, the weight of our planet. But there's much, much more. Consequently, there's much more energy flowing through the complexity of our planet per unit mass. Now, the first thing about this is total thermodynamics. This is what happens. Complexity forms because it's not intentional. It's just how it happens. The universe abhors an energy gradient, and it's trying to get rid of that energy gradient, and the fastest way to get rid of an energy gradient is complexity. That's why life forms, etc. It's dumping heat. It's dumping that concentrated energy into the universe faster than something less complex. There is another thing about complexity and about that value, energy per unit mass per unit time. It also means it is more and more prone to decay, anthropic decay. Okay? So the more complex things you have in general, the more likely it is to decay. More quickly, it's more likely to quickly decay than something less complex. And we'll come back and we'll see why that's important. So I wanted to talk a bit about supply chains because, as was said earlier, we don't see complexity. It's attenuated in objects, and we lose it. So this is quite unrealistic, but I'm just using it as an example because it's a calculation you can do. FEASTA, okay? One of the places where I apply my trade. How many things does it require to work? Okay, just, this is very hand-washy. Well, we booked a flight. This is over the last flight. Number 2 is we have a computer, we have a pencil, we have a salary. And actually, if you take individual different things, there's about 136 things, okay? Let's assume that the computer also takes 136 things to make it. And one of those things is a microprocessor, and it also takes 136 things to make it. And that one of those things is a lithography system. So we're just going down 136 down, but we're going to stop here at 5 levels. Any idea how many economic transactions are involved in that? 47 billion. Okay? Now, a computer has far more than 136 components. A motor car has about 15,000. And about 40 or 50 of those parts are engines and are motors, complex things in themselves. And when we talk about a motor car having 15,000 components, we're not talking about the very complex fabrication system, the robots and all of that. We're not talking about the office people and their computers. We're not talking about on and on. So what we see is the very simple things around us that are attenuated have billions, trillions and trillions and trillions of economic interactions crisscrossing the world, embedded behind them. Now, don't worry about that. Now, the thing is, that is a total miss. I was trying to get the calculation to show you the size. That's not how it works, as we'll see. But the first thing is, because of all of that, our welfare is smeared all over the globe. That's part of what we mean by the globalized economy. There's no end to supply chains. It requires globalized economies of scale. It needs lots of economically active people to engage in all of this to make it all viable. It needs consumers and makers and purchasers crisscrossing the world. That's why it keeps going. That cycle of more and more people, more and more wealth, more and more activity allows more and more complexification, more and more diverse roles, more and more economic activity. It's recursive. I'll show you what recursive means in a second. Self-organized and delocalized. So here's an example of your mobile phone. There where all your base parts of it come from. You've got a bit of crude oil there, bromine, zinc, whatever. North America, South America, Africa, Asia, Australia. It's everywhere. Now, that isn't the beginning journey of your mobile phone. Because in order to get all of those metals, what did you need? You need machines and mines and specialty chemicals. And that is why we talk about recursive. It all goes back. It's not a beginning and an end. It's all mixed up and interacting. And we start to see that, to make, say, this, let's say, tantalum viable, you need lots of equipment to mine the tantalum. It's pretty specialized place. You also need a good market for tantalum out in the world. If they were only making it for my mobile phone, it would be a very expensive mobile phone, and we probably couldn't afford the network. So that's what, trying to get a sense of the complexity of things. Now, critical infrastructure. It's all of that hard stuff that we think of, roads, the grid, power stations, water and waste systems, all of that. And in a sense, when we saw that FEASTA diagram and all of those interactions, behind that was a common infrastructure, more or less. Money is a very important one, which is an infrastructure. It's a cultural, social infrastructure as well as a physical one. Energy, communications, food, water and waste, all of these things. Now, there's some things we can say about them. The first is they have evolved at the scale and capacity to deal with the world as it is now. In other words, or even a bigger one, because things are built in growth. So I built my communications network because I expect traffic to increase 5% per year for the next 10 years. Or my sewerage system is big enough, I've built new houses, new parts of cities, and the pipes are wide enough to expect, that amount of waste, all of these things. Greater scale and complexity. Things like the grid or information backbone networks are the most complex things on the planet, or amongst the most complex things on the planet, most resource-intensive things on the planet. And we say most complex, we immediately think of, even more prone to faster decay of components, of elements. They have, therefore, lifetimes, relatively short lifetimes. They rely on just-in-time delivery. So when we look at, say, an energy system, and we think of energy, in a way, in a modern economy, it's not energy that we're after, really. It's a range of things. We're looking for maintenance flows, operation flows, one of which is energy, okay? It's only one part, because, if you lose a switching system and you can't replace it, it doesn't matter how much oil you can afford or gas you can afford, the system doesn't work. It also obviously it expects, most resource intensive and specialized, least substitutability. If you have a very complex component, it's quite likely that very few people, if that component maker goes down for whatever reason, that very few other people can make it, okay? That's the nature of complexity. So for instance, if you remember the volcano in Iceland, one of the consequences was that 3 BMW plants went down in Germany. Why? Because they missed a component. Now, for BMW, they obviously never thought that something like this could block out their airspace for X many days. So for them it was quite normal, but 3 plants shut down. Now, this is one of the interesting things. I don't know if the word monopoly is the right word. Maybe you can suggest one. But our most critical infrastructure has no operational alternative in real terms. If I don't like this grid that supplies this place, I can't just go and turn it onto another grid. Or if I don't like pooing in this water, in this sewerage system, there's not another sewerage system that I can use in preference. Now, you might say, yes, you can go off grid, you can use a composting toilet, but we're talking about the large scale for society. There's no operational alternative. So our most critical infrastructure are effectively physical monopolies. Massive embedded investment, globalized economies of scale. In other words, in a way, for our phones, for our grid, we're all paying a little bit. And that makes it viable. And we can pay for that little bit because we're exchanging our labors across the globe. And they can make the things we want because they have critical infrastructure and it's working for them, and they can afford it because we're interacting with them. So it's part of this network of systems that are... somebody get me water, please, because I feel I'm drying out. So the other thing about it is these systems require discretionary and non-discretionary use. Now, what I mean by that is, when people sometimes say, what we need to do is get rid of all the rubbish we're consuming, okay, and use all the good stuff, the important things. Well, the thing is that infrastructure is viable because, we're texting, using YouTube, playing video games, as much as because businesses using it for critical work. In other words, it requires us all. It requires that global integrated use. It makes no distinction. It's viable because we're buying rubbish. Now, here is, following the attacks in September in 2001, there became a new awareness about critical infrastructure interdependencies. And, of course, what you find is you don't have to look very hard. This is a simplified version of one person's analysis. They're all tied up together, okay? Your water, wasting water requires electricity and power. It requires chlorine for things, etc., never mind repair and updating electricity. All of these things you can see. I just want to put a little bit of a note here in case I forget to mention it later. When we're talking about crises or collapse, there's a popular narrative of that Mad Max, that we're all going to go around killing each other and jumping on each other's head for the last shred of clothes or the piece of rice from their pocket. That may be, but actually civil conflicts like that don't tend to last too long. They burn out pretty quickly. A far more greater threat is water and waste. We're very clean people. We've got a very clean water system on getting rid of our waste. But if that goes, because your electricity goes, number one is we've no vulnerability to, we're no good at fighting many of the diseases that people in much dirtier parts of the world have. And it is likely to be one of the biggest, or the biggest, sources of human mortality in the Western world, in the developed world, is water and waste. And it's one of the things that we have to work out what to do.